considering the Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin. He started with a long story about the Russian history, and after that he was talking about what was really going on between Russia and NATO. When you look at this interview, what was your take on the reasons behind this conflict in Ukraine? Before doing that, I'm gonna play a clip for you. Let's see what the Western part is talking about and how do they see the reasons behind this conflict in Ukraine.
President Putin actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. So he went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO close to his borders.
Flashback.
This is fundamentally not about NATO expansion.
It was never about NATO enlargement.
It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO expanding toward Russia.
This was never about NATO.
It's absolutely nothing to do with NATO expansionism.
And it has nothing to do with NATO.
This is not about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It's not really about NATO.
This is not about NATO.
Seriously, it's not about NATO.
This was never about NATO.
It was never about NATO. Let's be honest.
This doesn't have anything to do with NATO.
Nothing to do with NATO at all.
Yeah, he's claiming it's like security purposes, but we can see the clear reason.
But NATO is not the reason.
This is not about NATO expansion. This is about the democratic expansion.
Ukraine bans religious organizations.
We are protecting democracy right now.
Ukraine is banning political parties.
Because it's a democracy.
Ukraine restricts books and music.
It's about democracy.
Ukraine won't hold elections.
It's about democracy.
And it's not about NATO expansion.
This war in Ukraine is not about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
That's not about NATO.
It has nothing to do with NATO.
Nothing to do with NATO expansion.
It's not about NATO expansion.
Nothing to do with NATO.
It isn't really about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO enlargement. In fact, it has nothing to do with NATO.
It's not about NATO encroaching.
It's not about NATO. NATO is just a fictitious, imaginary adversary for Mr. Putin and for Russia.
It was never about NATO.
That's not what it's been about. It's been about him trying to expand his sphere of influence.
Hang on, I mean, the two are not mutually exclusive. Obviously, Russia has wished for a sphere of influence over Ukraine, but if the West had not challenged Russian interests so directly, I think that there was a chance to avoid this war.
Ray, you saw what was happening during these 19 months of this conflict in Ukraine. Two main issues were mentioned in this interview with Tucker Carlson. The first issue was the NATO expansion, and the second issue was denazification. Could you elaborate on that, and what's your take?
Well, we know for sure that it was not about NATO, Nima. I mean, I don't know who put that little thing together, but it speaks volumes, doesn't it? Here is the NATO Secretary General saying, gosh, I think he said it back last summer, okay? Maybe September of last year. He said, look, here's what it was. We wanted to make Ukraine part of NATO. And they said, no. And we said, well, we're going to do it anyway. And they said, you better not, because we'll not tolerate that. And we said, well, what will you do? And the Russians said, well, we'll have to attack Ukraine. And guess what? We turned them away. We said, nothing doing. And they got an expanded NATO. Look, they got Finland and they got Sweden, maybe. Oh, yeah. So instead of getting a smaller NATO, they got an expanded NATO. So the joke's on them. Bottom line here is that we just turned aside their request that we not let Ukraine join NATO in explicit rejection of the prospect that Russia would invade Ukraine. And here is Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, bragging about how we flipped that off and look what happened, we're expanded there. I mean, so he said this before the European Parliament, right? He was bragging. He thought it was a good thing that Finland would get in, and that Sweden maybe, and the Ukraine, and we got a nice war. I mean, hello, all those other statements were just weeks and months before Stoltenberg made this glaring admission. So the whole thing about NATO enlargement, Putin did dwell on that several times in this interview. He talked about 5 waves of NATO enlargement. He said, you know, the U.S. promised not to do this in 1990, 1991, and but it wasn't written down on a piece of paper, says Putin. And so they said, well, no piece of paper, we'll go ahead. And so that's how it evolved. All of a sudden, not only nearby NATO countries, but countries, new countries that had been part of the USSR, had been part of the Soviet Union, you know, and you had the Baltic states. You had Ukraine yearning to get in NATO. Now, Putin also mentioned, if memory serves, that back in, yeah, he did, you know, back in 2008, okay, 2008, there were these rumors, okay. Now, this is not what Putin said, but it's what I'm adding as a flavor here. There were rumors that they were going to invite Ukraine into NATO. And a lot of us thought, yeah, that's really crazy because Russia will not stand for that. Now, even Fiona Hill, the Russophobe person who was working in the intelligence committee at that time, brags about saying, "Oh, we didn't think that was a good idea at the time." You know, well, why did she say that? Well, why didn't she quit? We're going to do it, right? So, what do? Bush and Cheney are going out into the Western sunset in 2009, and so they say, "Well, yeah, let's make it possible that we invite Ukraine into NATO." And so when they met, well, first off, in February of 2008, when this rumor was going round and about, the newly appointed foreign minister of Russia, his name was Sergei Lavrov, he's still the foreign minister, he called our ambassador, whose name is William Burns. You may recognize that. He's now head of the CIA, okay? Call him in, Mr. Ambassador. He said, do you know what "niet" means? Burns says to him, yeah, it means no. Yeah, "niet." There is a red line for Moscow. No admission of Ukraine or Georgia into NATO. Do you understand that, Mr. Barnes? Yes. Will you report that back to your supervisors? I will. And tell them this. Tell them that if they admit Ukraine anyway, there's bound to be a civil war in Ukraine, and we, Russia, will have to decide whether we have to invade. Get that? He told Burns that. And to his credit, Burns was playing it pretty straight in those days, and he reported it all back to Washington. That was February 2nd, if memory serves. Fast forward to April 3rd, the NATO summit declaration says Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. Now, were the Allies in agreement on that? No. The Germans and the French say now, and they said then, we don't like this at all, but, you know, it takes a long time to join NATO, and Bush and Cheney are really, really hot on this. So they conceded. They bowed, as they always do, these vassal countries. And they said, oh, okay, yeah, it doesn't matter if rhetoric, we'll just say, okay. So that's the background. That's 2008. Actually, Putin recounted a lot of what I just said. So you fast forward. What happens? In 2014, Putin mentioned this, that the U.S. invested $5 billion, with a B, dollars for Ukrainians' aspirations to join the West. Oh, isn't that nice? There were lots of supporting elements for the National Endowment for Democracy, the spinoff from the CIA Covert Action Staff, about 55 of them in Ukraine when this coup d'etat took place. And long story short, it was the most blatant coup d'etat in history since it was advertised on YouTube on the 4th of February, took place on the 22nd of February. Well, Putin's very clear and say, I came back and we consulted. We had to do something about Crimea, our only all-weather, all-year-round, ice-free naval base. And so we took that after a plebiscite showing that the Crimeans really wanted to rejoin Russia. What he didn't say was that Donetsk and Lugansk, the two provinces in the Donbass, they wanted Putin to take them in too. You know, they pleaded with him. You took Crimea, take us. We're mostly Russian stock. For God's sake, they're shelling us. And Putin said, no, we're going to work this out. And he took the word of the French and the Germans and initially the Poles, who guaranteed that the Minsk Accords, so to speak, 2015, would be implemented. What did that mean? That meant Kiev would give the outlying provinces, Donetsk and Lugansk, a measure of autonomy, okay? That they stop shelling them, okay? And that Ukraine would adhere to its constitution, which actually provides it to be a neutral country. So they worked on that from 2015 until 2022. Wow, what's that? 7 years. Now, why all the delay? Well, we know now. The two guarantor countries, Germany and France, Chancellor Angela Merkel of the Federal Republic of Germany, she admitted in December of 2022, well, this was really a trick to give us more breathing space. You see, back in 2014, Ukrainian army wasn't worth a damn. So we needed all these years to build up to NATO standards with NATO weaponry. And well, look at them now. They're very strong armies. So we kind of strung them along. A month later, Francois Hollande, the president of France at the time, said the same thing, okay? So Putin himself, not in this interview, but in other speeches, has said, I was naive. His word, okay? I took them at their word. I should have known from their refusal to adhere to their promise not to enlarge NATO. I should have known. I should trust these people, but I get played, okay? That's not going to happen again, okay? Now, it shows, in my view, a very strong leader that can say, I was naive, and look at the consequences of all that. But he did, and he can, and that shows me something about the security of his position as leader of Russia. So, long way of saying that the NATO membership was really, really key for Putin against the Ukrainian become a member. And the other thing that he was able to explicate, to describe, which he really hadn't before to a Western journalist, was that they had a deal. The invasion was February 24. In a week, Zelensky and the Russians both expressed themselves interested in working out some kind of deal, so I stopped this stupid carnage, right? So they met initially in Belarus, and then as Putin talked, he said, we met in Istanbul, and we initialed an agreement. He goes like this, it was this thick, okay? And the head Ukrainian negotiator, who's not some outlier or dissenter, he's head of Zelensky's faction in the Rada in the Ukrainian parliament. This negotiator has now admitted that I had signed, says he, I had signed this thing, most of it anyway, and it was all ready. And what happened was, and the Russians agreed to pull their troops back from around Kiev, another thing that Putin said. But then the Americans and the British, in the person of Boris Johnson, the clown who messes up just about everything, he came to Kiev and said, no, don't do it. If you do that, you will lose any support, Zelensky, from the West, because we are all powerful. We have these fancy weapons, and we promise that we will support you till the last Ukraine. No, they didn't say till the last Ukraine, for as long as it takes, right? Well, Zelensky made a fateful decision. He threw as Putin said, he threw the papers in the trash can, okay? And that was before the flower of Ukrainian youth, the numbers between 400 and 500,000 troops met their creator or died, got killed, okay? So we're talking, it could have ended in 6 weeks. Now it's closing on 2 years. That's unconscionable. And the point here is that Putin had he had an occasion during which he could kind of say this. The ground rules were that there was no limit on talking. And that's to the both of their credit. I mean, Tucker Carlson said, all right, you're the president of Russia. We're interested in what you have to say, and my fellow Americans are. So not only did he take us through a little bit of early Russian history, Kiev and Rus, and the problems with the Poles and Lithuanians. We could talk a little bit about that because I used to teach that history. But the major thing is that Putin took advantage of the opportunity to say in public what he said in speeches and stuff. But this is to a Western reporter, to just kind of go right down to how close we were to ending this thing, how he removed his troops from around Kiev as soon as this thing was initialed, and then all of a sudden the West put the kibosh on this. And it's not altogether clear to me that that's the sole reason he pulled his troops back from around Kiev. They weren't doing such a good job. They weren't having such a good success there. But he did nonetheless do that, and that was not acknowledged as any kind of conciliatory measure by the West. Now, how do we finish this little thing? He was asked, of course, why don't you call up President Biden? And this is a cool customer, this Putin. He's sung froid by the millions. He says, well, why? I mean, all President Biden has to do is stop sending weapons, and the war would end in just a couple of weeks. Everyone actually acknowledges that, East and West. So why should I call him? He knows. And now we have a report in the New York Times, fresh off the press, which I just printed out, that Putin's offer for talks has been rejected by the White House spokesperson. Surprise, surprise. National Security Council spokesman said in a statement, despite Putin's words, we have seen no actions to indicate that he's interested in ending this war. If he was, he would pull back his forces and stop his ceaseless attacks on Ukraine. Well, he's not going to do that. He's not going to do that because Russian core interests are involved here. U.S. core interests are not involved here. Who else said that besides McGovern? Obama, when he was president. He cautioned about giving weaponry to Ukraine. He said, number one, you're going to give the Ukrainian army the idea that they can defeat a much more powerful neighbor. You don't want to mislead them that Obama said that, okay? And what else did he say? I said, yeah, he said, it doesn't make a lot of sense to to pursue interests that could lead to war when the other side has core interests and you don't. And Russia has core interests here and we don't. Obama's words. I think he said that to one of his biographers, that fellow from the Atlantic, what's his name? Jeffrey Goldberg, I think. That was 2015, 2016. So Obama had been around for a while. He knew which end this up. He resisted. He resisted giving arms to Ukraine. And there was a fellow who was the Deputy Secretary of State at the time. And he was, well, his name was Antony Blinken. And he was saying this would be a big mistake to give arms to Ukraine. Just what the president said, it would be a big mistake. It would just, that was Blinken 2015. All of a sudden, Biden comes in. Now it's a swell idea. You know, I mean, it's really strange. Wasn't Biden Obama's vice president? I think he was, you know. Wasn't Blinken in the flow of things here? He was. Well, he agreed in 2015, but then he changed his mind when Biden got the idea that we, as he said to this 60-minute reporter, could we get involved in two wars, one in Ukraine and one in Southwest Asia, and prevail? We're the United States of America. We're the most powerful nation in the history of the world. Did you hear that? In the history of the world. End quote. Well, that's an attitude. And that attitude is now bringing us much grief. It was true when I was a boy after World War II. It was true when the Russian economy and everything fell apart. And we certainly didn't help repair it very much. We were causing it to fall apart and taking a lot of the natural resources there and letting the oligarchs, both East and West, have their way with Russian national production. So, you know, it's kind of ironic that most people don't know much of this history. And it was great that Tucker Carlson finally succeeded in having this kind of substantive discussion. But B-U-T. It's not on American TV. It's not in American newspapers. The mainstream media has been able to keep pretty much anything substantive about this discussion out. They only talk about this Wall Street Journal fellow that was caught and is in prison now. Talk about anything else. So the question is, I think Tucker Carlson has something like 170 million looks or whatever you call it on YouTube, and on his own channel more and so forth. So the question is, can Tucker Carlson do what Julian Assange did? And what Julian did, of course, was to recognize that the so-called Fourth Estate was dead, okay? And he needed a new Fifth Estate, and he found that in the ether, right? And he used the ether to get authentic information down into computers here and available to Americans and everyone else. Now, he was shut down. He's been in prison for many, many years now. That's how much they fear Julian Assange. How about Tucker Carlson? They tried to prevent him from going to Moscow. He has said that twice. Some don't want to let him come back in the country. Why? Because he interviewed the president of Russia. So the situation here is very reminiscent of the 50s when you had Senator McCarthy accusing anybody and everybody of being soft on Russia and soft on China. It's very, very noxious atmosphere here. And it remains to be seen. That's my bottom line. Sadly, it remains to be seen whether these 170 million looks on YouTube will make any dent in how how Americans view what Putin has said. Now, you showed a very instructive clip when we began this, okay? Now, how many Americans have seen that? Maybe, I don't know, 2,000, 3,000? But that needs to be seen too, because it says, it's not about NATO, it's not about, of course, it's all about NATO. And one of the provisions, I'll finish with this, of that agreement that they reached in Istanbul, April 1st, 2022, not April Fool's Day, it was a real deal, okay? One of the provisions, of course, was neutrality for Ukraine. So no membership in NATO. So why did the US and the British come in and say, all right, that's not enough. We want NATO membership for Ukraine, but even more, we want to use Ukraine as a tool to weaken Russia. Now, I'm not making that up. That's what our defense minister, our Secretary of Defense, Austin said. He said, look, this is a quote. We are going to use this arms. We will move heaven and earth to weaken Russia. Well, it may be that in the old days, the US could move heaven and earth. I'm not sure, but we certainly were much more powerful then than we are now. And it's been a year, almost a year and a half since Austin said those things. And I don't think that moving heaven and earth is really an option for anyone, not even a pretentious president like ours, who still thinks that the US is the United States of America, which can work its will wherever because it's the strongest country in the history of the world. In the history of the world, get it? The history of the world.
One of the key points that was mentioned by Putin in this interview was at the very moment that Tucker Carlson asks him about BRICS and G7. And he says these are two different sides, when which country belongs to which part. And he said something interesting about the human brain, the two parts of the human brain that are totally different in terms of their function. It comes to a solution that if we want to have a prosperous world for all of us, we have to work together. Despite having our differences, we have to work together. When you watch this interview, the guy who comes out of this interview, that we call him Putin, the leader of Russia, do you see this guy a man of peace or a man of war?
He certainly presents himself as a reasonable person who is not interested in war, but will do everything he can or everything that he needs to do to defend his country. Now, if that includes invading Ukraine, that's the way he looked at it. Now, when people say, was he provoked? Of course he was provoked. I took you way back to 2008, and Lavrov told William Burns, if you try to get Ukraine into NATO, that will provoke us. We will have to decide whether we intervene or not, okay? And then, as Stoltenberg has admitted, the Russians told NATO, look, this is very serious stuff. No Ukraine in NATO, or we may have to invade. And then Stoltenberg said, oh, so we said no, and they invaded, and now NATO is even larger. Crazy people. They don't realize what the old Soviets used to call the correlation of forces here. There used to be a sort of equal sort of correlation of forces. Now it's this way, and it's this way because Russia and China have been driven away and into each other's arms. I mean, I could not think of a more stupid diplomacy than to take the other two major superpowers, drive them together instead of driving them apart. And that's what's really happened here. That's the background of all this. And it's really strange to me that even somebody like Blinken and Sullivan well, Noland is another case, but could Blinken and Sullivan not realize that Russia and China are becoming more and more in an alliance? Could they not realize that Iran and Russia have all but signed a treaty of strategic cooperation? My God, you don't see that in the Western press. I wonder why. It's all but concluded. It just needs to be signed and to ratified, I suppose, but includes military provisions. Now, probably we don't have the text of it yet, but very probably it's like the Russia-China treaty, which is not literally a mutual defense treaty obligating each side to come to the aid of the other one automatically if it's attacked. It's more well, as the Russians and Chinese describe their treaty, it's a cooperation treaty with no end, no upper end, okay? We're going to cooperate. We don't like alliances because they exclude other people. This is not against anybody else. This is how closely we will cooperate. And you can be sure that if either Russia or China gets involved in a military conflict with the United States, it won't stay in one arena. It will go to both. And the U.S. is not prepared for that. Problem is that these sophomores that are advising Biden have never worn a uniform, no experience in war. Even Biden, last time I checked, he had 5 deferments during Vietnam, the same number that we used to ridicule Dick Cheney for, 5 deferments. Now, doesn't matter what I think. Here's Putin looking on these guys, wet behind the ears, okay? No knowledge of war. As Lavrov said just 3 weeks ago, the U.S. has been protected by 2 very large oceans in the past. That's no longer the case, says Lavrov. Don't count on it this time around. Whoa. Well, again, the Russians are coming out of an experience where they lost 26 million plus people during World War II. Our own casualties, all of them military people, amounted to about 440,000. So put 440,000 against 26 million, and you know that every Russian has somebody, some relative that died in that war. And now they watch people like the Germans saying, oh, we might have to do a war with Russia again. I mean, I am amazed that Putin and Lavrov have been as less acerbic as they could be, because I think they feel this, and they feel that they're not being listened to. Obviously, they weren't. And the whole deal here is that we left Putin no other chance. This was not only provoked, but he had no other options. Now, that's saying a lot. Not everyone agrees on that. Some people say, well, he could have, Putin could have put submarines threatening our bases in Norfolk and Charleston. Oh, I wouldn't have advised him to do that. Somebody else said, editorial director said, oh, he could have got an African country to put in troops along the line between, Donbass and, I mean, hello. I go by John Mearsheimer, who's the best on this, who was right 9 years ago saying this is a terrible mistake and it is the fault of the West. He says Putin had no other options. We left him no options. And there's a strain analysis that said this is precisely what people like Nuland and others wanted. They wanted the Russians to come in here. And that way they could blame and banish them and put trade sanctions on them and weaken them, as Secretary Austin said so stupidly, but betrayed what's going on here. So as long as we're trying to weaken Russia by putting the last soldiers from Ukraine into the fight, well, I'm not proud of that as an American citizen. And I think the Ukrainians may wake up once they look at what other soldiers they can impress into service. And once they realize that, look, we're not getting any more weapons from the United States. I repeat that. We're not going to get those weapons from the United States. No matter what Godmother Nuland promised last week. You know, she went to Kiev. She's the godmother of all this. I call her Nolinsky. Anyhow, she went and she said, look now, boys, sit down. This is the way it's going to go. Zelensky, you fired Zaluzhny on Monday, right? Yeah. What happened? He said he wouldn't be fired. Zaluzhny, did you say that? Yeah. Well, tell him again. You're fired. You hear that, Zaluzhny? You're not going to get any more aid. You're not going to get any support from the United States. We're going to close on those chateaus you have in the Riviera. Okay, I'll go. Friday, Zelensky is gone. We're going to pick to be the new head of the army or the head of armed forces. Well, they say, Zelensky says to Nolinsky, how about Budanov? Budanov, he'd be good. You know, he said, and she's that right? Budanov, that sounds Russian. Well, yeah, he's a Russian stock. You got any more skis? Oh, yeah, we could do Siersky. So they'll go with Siersky as the head. He screwed up big time against Bakhmut and lost thousands of soldiers necessarily there. But he's now the new commander-in-chief. Now, I think there's got to be a reckoning pretty soon, because even though the Russians are gradually doing a moderate advance, attriting and attrition is the name of the game, the Ukrainians are going to have to do something pretty soon. And I think that they're finally going to realize that they too have been had. I mean, they too have been deceived. That even the president of the United States most frequently said, we're going to support the Ukrainians, not for as long as it takes, but for as long as we can. And we can't anymore. So sorry, guys. Find your Riviera spots or go off to nice spots in Abu Dhabi, but we're gone. And, you know, so disreputable to look at that, because that's, of course, what we did most recently in Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam. It's awful.
The other issue that Putin mentioned in this interview, when Tucker Carlson asked him if he has achieved all of his objectives in Ukraine, he said, no, we are about to achieve it, but we didn't achieve it yet. That is the denazification of Ukraine. And Tucker Carlson was laughing at, what does it mean? How you can achieve that? Are you going to kill all of them in the western part of Ukraine? The answer to this question was so interesting that he said it has to be mentioned in the constitution of Ukraine. He also said that in that document in Istanbul, this denazification was mentioned and it was part of the agreement. When it comes to this, I want to know what's your take on this and how logic is that, in your opinion?
Well, Putin mentioned two main objectives right before he launched the offensive. One was demilitarization, and Russia has pretty much achieved that. There's not much left of the Ukrainian army. That's fact, okay? You may recall that Biden said in July that Russia had already lost. I don't know who told him to say that, but that was exactly wrong, okay? Now they've won. So demilitarization has gone gradually, but it's pretty much total now, okay? Now, denazification, that's been always kind of a tough row to hoe here. How do you do that? Like you say, it's difficult. But the people that are the Azov Battalion, for example, and the Nazis who are celebrating Stepan Bandera and other Nazis who cooperated with the Germans, my God, they're identifiable. The Nazis that killed those 40 Russians in Odessa in the trade union building, burn them alive or throw them outside the window. They know that Russians know who these guys are, okay? So that would take longer, but by and by, it's possible. And as the army kind of implodes, and I imagine the police force will do not much better, then this will be a gradual process. But for Putin to emphasize that, it's more than a neuralgic reaction to what happened during World War II. It's a practical problem because these people are the ones responsible for treating the Russians in Ukraine so in such a way that Putin finally decided he had to invade. Now, one little factoid that not many people know is that in February of 2022, two things. Putin went up to Beijing to help Xi Jinping open the Winter Olympics. That was on the 4th of February. They conferred, Putin came back, and it seems to me, given subsequent events and what we know of the Chinese attitude, Putin told Xi Jinping, look, I'm going to have to go into Ukraine because not only are they doing all kinds of mischief elsewhere, but the shelling in Ukraine has gone up. Mid-February, I think it was February 13th, there were 500 shellings of the Donbass, okay, of Lugansk and Donetsk. 5 days later, there were something like 5,000, okay? It was a geometric increase in the number. So this was just before the move into Ukraine, and the bulk of Ukrainian forces were poised right on the border of Donetsk. So Putin, as he explained it later, said, I should have done this in 2014 when the Ukrainian army wasn't worth a damn, but I'm going to do it now, partly to protect my fellow Russians of Russian stock. I think his feelings about that are not to be laughed at. They're very deep, and he regrets what's going on in Latvia and other places where Russians are really taking it on the chin. Why? Because the Russian Federation dissolved into many parts, and nobody gave a second thought to what happens to those Russian citizens that end up in Riga, Latvia, or in Lithuania, or in Estonia, or in Ukraine. So that's a thing that he has to deal with. The other thing is this, that in February of 2022, Biden and Putin had their last conversation. I think it's probably going to be their last. February 12th. Okay, so right after Putin comes back from China, he talks to Biden. And what he says is, Mr. Biden, on the 30th of December, our last tete-a-tete by phone, you said that you had no intention of putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. We know that you have the capability, the emplacements in Poland and Romania now. Well, you told me you had no intention of putting those kinds of emplacements in Ukraine. Now, when our negotiators came together on the 9th and 10th of January, just 10 days later, they didn't know anything about this. We asked them, and they said, what kind of promise? It's in the readout. We said, no, we don't have any instructions on that, okay? And so the readout from this conversation between Biden and Putin was that Biden refused to address two key elements. One, his undertaking not to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, and number two, he wouldn't even discuss not allowing Ukraine, prohibiting Ukraine from joining NATO. Okay, two key requests. So we have February the 12th. Then we have the uptick in the shelling of Donbass, and we have Putin, who I'm pretty sure must have had assurances from Xi Jinping that China would give Russia, in effect, a waiver, a waiver on Westphalia. Okay, we're really, again, our bedrock principle is no interference in the affairs of other countries. No, we don't do the violation of borders, but this time we'll make an exception. Even Chinese rhetoric changed. They changed from Westphalia to each country is entitled to react when their core interests are involved in a forceful manner. We Chinese judge the events by the particular events on the ground. Well, what happened to Westphalia? That's what they said for several weeks and a month or two. Now they're back to Westphalia, but that's understandable. So that was my clue that Putin, before he went into the Donbass, was sure they had Big Brother watching over his shoulder, who would not criticize him and would even support him in a political way, if not give him military equipment, if and when it's needed. Putin has not needed China to give any military stuff, economic stuff galore, of course, but no military stuff. So there is this entente, there is this virtual alliance between Russia and China. The bright young fellows around Biden don't seem to realize the implications of that. And when Biden can brag about no problem with two wars at the same time because we're the United States of America, the most strong country, I mean, that's delusional. And it's very, if I were Putin, I would have to worry because, how is Biden going to cope with losing in Ukraine? Well, it seems to me what they're trying to do is to get the EU to fund some more weaponry, but even that's not going to get there in time. If the Russians decide to go to the Dnieper River, they could do it tomorrow, okay? Yeah, they'd take more casualties, but by chipping away, they could do it next month with virtually no casualties. So what's Biden want to do? Well, doesn't have many options because if he loses in Ukraine, he'll lose the election. If he loses the election, he'd be liable, just like his friend Netanyahu, to prosecution for bribery and other things. So what I'm saying here is that there's a personal stake in here, and that's what persuades me that although mini nukes should ipso facto be ruled out, when push comes to shove, and they have no more of these other things, even depleted uranium and stuff like that, then one of these acolytes is going to say, well, Mr. Biden, we have that stuff on the top shelf. Those are the mini nukes behind the combination lock. Well, we have the combination there. Let's use one of those and we'll show Russia that we really mean business. And I think that should carry us through November, and maybe we won't lose the election. Now, when I hear myself saying that, as I think I've said before, the hair rises on the back of my head because I've been around a long time, and I've never been so concerned that people out of personal and political considerations would do that kind of thing. It would take a great deal of naivete, selfishness, whatever, but it could lead to the end of all of us, Nima. And I have 10 grandchildren. I'd like to see them flourish.
Putin clearly said that he's not going to do anything, even with Latvia and Poland that are much closer than Germany and United Kingdom and other countries. In your opinion, was that convincing for Europeans?
Biden said this, of course. He said, Putin's not going to stop if we let him take Ukraine. Well, number one, I don't think Putin wants to take all of Ukraine. He'll settle for pretty much what he has. Might want to take all of eastern Ukraine up to the Dnieper River. I don't know. That would depend, okay? So he's not going to take Ukraine. And as he put it, he sort of smiled and said, Latvia? Why would I want to do that? Oh my God, why? Okay. Now, yes, you have to be in the mindset that Joe Biden is in way back in the Cold War to say, well, of course, Russians want to take Poland. Of course, they want to take back the Russian. One of the funny things is that when Putin described his discussions with Bill Clinton in the last year of Clinton's tendency in the White House, he said, look, Bill, let us join NATO. That'd be a good idea. I mean, look, this is his word too. We're as bourgeois as you can be. This whole commie, is he just a clever commie? No, we have the kind of economy that you do. We're bourgeois up to kazoo. Why don't we just get along and why should you let us into NATO? And Clinton says, really? What would you do? I said, well, we could talk. That would be great. We could talk about rapprochement. We could deal with this thing. Just like he didn't say this, but that was the vision that the first George Bush had. Europe, whole and free from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Okay, a nice vision. It could have been. It could have been. Okay, so here's the last chance for Bill Clinton to repair the damage he did by expanding NATO and throwing that non-piece of paper out into the rubbish, okay? And now, so what did he say? This is really interesting. Obama says, well, now you could check with Clinton, but he's not gonna, I don't think he's gonna contradict me. I mean, look, he said, well, yeah, that's good. That's a good idea. But I have to check with my team. That was around lunchtime. Came back at dinner. And he said, oh, Vladimir, I've checked with my team. It's a non-starter. A non-starter. Wow. Why? Well, because the military-industrial complex needs an enemy, for God's sake. It's pretty much reduced to that. Trifle oversimplified, but you can play on the previous behavior of Russia, the previous fear of Russia, and you can build common European battle tanks, and you can build all kinds of stuff, and people get richer and richer, except the poor people, right? And so here you had a situation where Clinton was made a reasonable offer, but his team said no, and he's going to be out of office. So, and I don't have much, well, I won't say more about Bill Clinton, but you know what that reminded me of? That reminded me back in the 80s when I was still on active duty with the CIA. Gorbachev and Reagan met in Reykjavik, in Iceland. And by that time, Reagan had been persuaded that Gorbachev was the real deal, that he could deal with him, okay? And that he could reach arms accords and, trust but verify, but he could trust, okay? And Gorbachev says at the end of one of these sessions, look, Mr. President Reagan, what we should do is we should abolish all nuclear weapons. And Reagan said, my God, the thought of it, that'd be so good. I have to talk to my team. Now, I wasn't there, but that's what happened, okay? He went to his team, and part of his team were these Russophobes and people who want to make money when they retired in the military-industrial complex. One of them's name is Fritz Ermarth. He pretty much concluded that he shouldn't have dissuaded. He pretty admits it that he shouldn't have dissuaded Ronald Reagan from this, and it was a big mistake. But what they did was say, look, Mr. Reagan, Mr. President, if you say no more nuclear weapons, then Star Wars is dead. We won't be able to protect the whole country with ABM systems. They happen to cost a lot of money. We make a lot of money, but that's our dream. You share that dream. If we can protect the whole United States from this impenetrable shield, bull, just, not right, I used the word, impenetrable shield. And then, you forego all that, and, we have to just trust, okay? So Ronald Reagan consulted with his team, and he went back and he said, Mikhail Gorbachev, it's a really nice offer, but my team says it's a non-starter. So who's running this country? Putin hinted that it's not the president. He knows quite well that the president doesn't have free will to make decisions. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, well, it's a bad thing in my view, because democracy should depend on balance of interests and power. But again, if you look at Putin and he sees a debilitated Biden, a Biden who is described by his own Justice Department as being enfeebled, lacking memory, and acting really like an old person. Wow. Well, that's not a good thing. If I were Putin, I would say, oh my God. So who else has that combination to those many nukes? And what the Russians have always won is stability on the other side of those codes for the nuclear weapons. That's why I have always concluded the Russians had no favor for Trump. Unpredictable, irrational, irascible. They didn't want Trump in there. And there's no proof that they did anything to ease his way into. Hillary shot herself in the foot. And there was no Russian hacking of those DNC emails. I'll just say that we've known that since December 5, 2017. Okay, so that's 6 years, 2 months, and a couple of days. 6 years we have known that. I have known that. You have known that, Nima. But the American people still don't know that because it hasn't been put in our media. Print media, TV, radio, nobody has said that this whole business about the Russians hacking and helping Hillary was made up stuff, and that it was pure lies, and that the people responsible for those lies should be held to account. The forensics are there. The guys who looked into the DNC computers testified under oath. There is no technical evidence that anyone hacked into those DNC emails, not Russia, not anybody else. It was not exfiltrated from the network. That means somebody took a thumb drive, stuck it in a machine, and copied them, not downloaded them, and gave them to WikiLeaks. So there's a lot Americans don't know, and what really bothers me, of course, is what they think they know. Who was it? I think it was Will Rogers, a very famous humorist a century or two ago. He said the problem is not what people don't know. It's what they think they know that ain't so. No, I wish it were funny, but how many people will know what Putin said to Tucker Carlson? How many people know that those phonies testified under oath that the Russians never hacked anything, and that the CIA, NSA, and the FBI were lying through their teeth? Well, unless there's a very, very big change in our country, unless people like you and me keep plugging away and trying to spread a little bit more truth around, it's always an uphill struggle. But you know what? I try to keep a balance here. And one of the things I remember, E.F. Stone, who was another publicist, he used to say, look, when you're fighting for the truth and for justice, you need to go into this business open-eyed, okay? You got to realize what, because you're going to lose. And then you're going to lose. And you're going to lose again, okay? But then some fine day, people who believe, as you do, that truth is important and justice is a result of truth, they're going to win, okay? Now, you may not be around to see that. But in the interim, you've got to keep your balance and, to the degree you can, your sense of humor. And that's a tall order, but I appreciate being able to talk to you and your audience, Nima, because it helps me kind of keep my balance and in the process, hopefully, give some information that otherwise people would not come by.